Welcome, class, to 7.1b, U.S. History. The American Revolution continued. It was the victory at Fort Saratoga on October 19th, 1777, that began the negotiations between the American revolutionaries and the French. The Americans, of course, were desperate for money to support their war effort, as well as any other kind of aid that any of the other European countries could offer them. The Americans had sent Benjamin Franklin as their representative to the French court to see if he could negotiate any kind of treaty between the French and the Americans. He was very successful in France. He understood politics, and he understood the need to play up his part as a rustic American. He would show up at parties with a beaver hat, and talk like a good homeboy, and the French loved that. They thought that was a lot of fun. So they loved him as a person, and he was also very wise about what he said and what he did not say, and this went over very well with the French. He was able to get the French to recognize American independence, and they also pledged to recognize American sovereignty if and when there was a peace treaty with England, and they would not try to negotiate a peace treaty without the other's consent. And he also was able to secure additional loans from France. Well, what did France want in return for all of these benefits? Well, France hoped to gain back some of the land that it had lost in the 7 Years' War. They also loved the idea of weakening the British Empire. However, they were quite concerned about supporting a revolution that went against its king. At this point, it was Louis XV on the throne. His father had been extraordinarily successful, and he was not nearly as successful. And his people were beginning the rumblings of revolution themselves. So he was a bit cautious about supporting a republic that went against its king. Spain, on the other hand, never actually made an agreement with the Americans officially. However, they did help the Americans by sending aid up the Mississippi River and by allowing the Americans to use the Mississippi River for trade. They wanted a return of Florida, and they were very anxious, however, that the Americans not expand any farther west. The American Indians were another factor in the Revolutionary War. They were not quite sure on which side they would fall. The Americans sent diplomats to go and negotiate with them to just simply stay out of the war, claiming that it was simply an internal matter between, as if it was part of a family feud, and that the Indians should not get involved. The British, however, greatly desired the Indians to get involved. They encouraged the Indians to unite amongst themselves against the Americans, and the Indians ended up joining with the British in this way because the Indians' goals were very similar to the British goals, and they both the British and the Indians feared the American expansionism. As a result of this, the fighting in the back country, especially south and west, became very brutal. Southern Patriot militia companies managed to drive the Cherokee tribe into the mountains. They would destroy whole towns and settlements and destroy crops, thousands of acres of crops. The Iroquois Union of Indians and the Loyalist forces also ended up raiding northern frontier towns in New York and Pennsylvania. But in retaliation, the Americans ended up destroying many of the Iroquois villages and thousands of crops of the Iroquois Indians as well. The American versus Indian hostilities did not end at the end of the Revolutionary War. They continued on for another 2 decades or 20 years with a lot of bloodshed and a very cruel and life-taking warfare. In the South, the Revolutionary War had several distinct turnings. Lord Dunmore, who was the governor of Virginia, issued a proclamation calling for all slaves to desert their masters in the South and to take up arms with the British against the Americans. Of course, this alienated the Southern elite who owned many slaves, and this was one of their greatest fears, that there would be a slave uprising. Many slaves did actually respond to this. In fact, 800 responded, but unfortunately many of them died due to smallpox. When Lord Dunmore sailed away after giving up his post as governor, only about 300 of them were left after the ravages of smallpox to sail away with him. There was a change in British strategy. The strategy had been for the British military to march in and force subjugation from the population, but they found that they were not enough soldiers to do that, and so they had to try to choose other ways. They ended up basically taking territory, handing it over to a loyalist who would then try to reassert colonial authority, and this also was not very successful either. General Clinton, who was a general in the South, had several great victories over Patriot resistance. The American defenders in the South found themselves greatly outflanked by British forces, and eventually they were forced to surrender 5,000 of their troops, which is a huge chunk of their military. The reinforcements were led by a general named Horatio Gates, who was the hero of Saratoga, the one who had been a great morale booster, the victory that had been a great morale booster right before the winter at Valley Forge. General Horatio Gates was also defeated by General Cornwallis in South Carolina, and so the southern states were never really won back by the revolutionary forces. In the North, the Patriots realized the weakness of having slaves in the North that could fight against them, and so they offered freedom to African Americans who would serve in the Patriot militia or in the Continental Army. And about 5,000 of these ex-slaves or men that would be given their freedom through military service joined up. In the lower South, slave owners lived in complete terror of a slave uprising because of the slaves' numerical superiority. So there, in the lower South, there was no movement towards emancipation. But in the upper South, quite a few slaves eventually won their freedom by military service. The British, however, did not win any friends in their trying to reconquer the southern states because of their actions of plundering towns and farms to try to feed their troops, and this produced a lot of anger towards the British by colonists who would have normally been loyalists. So those colonists eventually became patriots rather than loyalists. The Continental and Patriot forces also led guerrilla warfare against the British throughout their campaign in the South, and this actually quite weakened the British soldiers. Cornwallis eventually had to withdraw because of lack of popular and military support. The Battle of Yorktown at the time did not seem as momentous as it later would become. The French finally had sent over troops. They sent over about 5,000 troops, which landed at Newport under the command of General Rochambeau. And by mid-September 1780, about 16,000 combined troops, American and French soldiers, converged on the British-held Yorktown, which only had about 8,000 British soldiers manning it. And on October 19th, 1781, the British troops were forced to surrender. General Cornwallis, pleading illness, sent his second-in-command, Charles O'Hara, to surrender to Washington. And in London, when the news finally reached London at the end of November, Lord North, the Prime Minister at the time, received the news and cried, "Oh God, it's all over." So the cost of war was enormous, and there was very little public support for the Revolutionary War. And Lord North was forced to submit his resignation. In March of 1782, King George III was forced to accept American independence.